I'm the founder he laughed out of the room, and today I'm signing the documents that put his company under my control. The conference room is too clean, the kind of clean that tries to impersonate morality. New carpet adhesive still hangs in the air, sharp and plasticky, fighting with burnt coffee from an overheated carafe at the credenza. The table is walnut and flawless, polished until the recessed lights copy themselves across its surface like small, obedient moons. In the tinted glass behind the attorneys, the city skyline looks muted, as if someone turned the saturation down to make everything behave. The HVAC hum is steady enough to pass for calm, but I can hear the tremor in it when the door clicks shut and seals us in. Two lawyers on my side speak in low, practiced tones over the final red lines. Across from them, the bank's representative keeps checking his watch, releasing a faint cologne every time his wrist moves, as if impatience has a scent. In front of me sits the acquisition binder, thick, tabbed exhibits marching down the edge like teeth. I flip to the signature pages and see my name printed where I used to sign expense reports. Escrow instructions sit in a neat paragraph, clinical and irreversible. Everyone is treating this like routine, which is what I paid for. The appearance of inevitability. I roll the fountain pen between my fingers, feeling the ridges in the grip, listening to the soft scratch it makes when I test it on a corner of paper. My hands aren't shaking. That's the part that surprises me. 2 years ago, I couldn't speak in a meeting without watching my throat in the reflection of a dark monitor, afraid it would betray me with a swallow. Back then, he taught me that you can ruin someone without raising your voice. He did it with a laugh, a glance toward the others, and a sentence that sounded like advice. Now I'm the one with the documents, the one with counsel, the one who knows what board consent means in practice. And still, a small part of me is waiting for the room to turn on me again. The chair under me is leather and slightly cold, like it has been trained not to absorb human heat. I'm wearing a suit that fits because I stopped buying close enough the moment my first customer wired money I didn't have to beg for. My laptop is closed. I don't need to perform competence anymore. The attorneys already ran the checklist. Schedules, disclosures, the last of the red lines cleaned up so nobody can pretend they misunderstood. The banker's pen taps twice against his watch band, a small metronome for other people's deadlines. I look down at the tabs in the binder and can almost map the last 2 years by them. How many times I got told no, how many times I revised, how many nights I decided sleep was a luxury I'd earn later. They still call him a visionary in the trade press. That's the part that would be funny if it didn't make me feel slightly sick. He sponsors scholarship dinners, posts pictures with young interns, writes LinkedIn essays about humility and servant leadership with the same hands that used to flick my proposal back across a table. In public, he knows how to soften his eyes and lower his voice, like he's listening hard enough to make you matter. In private, he loved small cruelties, the ones that can't be reported because they sound petty when repeated. I remember the way he'd pause before saying my name, letting the silence suggest I wasn't worth remembering. I remember the laugh most of all, not loud because it was happy, loud because it was useful. One of my attorneys clears his throat and slides a single page toward me. The paper is thick, almost soft at the edge, and it smells faintly of ink and binder glue. "This is the board consent," he says, like he's announcing the weather. My eyes track the language that turns intention into authority. There's no poetry in it, just a series of approvals that make the next steps legal. Authorize the purchase, appoint officers, approve the escrow agent, accept the closing deliverables. I sign where the flag is placed, slow enough to feel the moment, fast enough not to look sentimental. The fountain pen scratches, a dry whisper in the room. For a second I hear his laugh layered over it, and I have to exhale through my nose to keep my face neutral. This isn't a movie moment where the villain is struck dumb by irony. It's administrative. That's what makes it terrifying. I'm here because I learned to respect boring details, the kind of details he used to ignore while he performed confidence for clients. In the last month, I've read more about his company than some of his executives have. I know which contracts renew automatically, which vendors threaten to tighten terms, which receivables are older than anyone wants to admit. During diligence, I saw patterns that didn't match the public story. Expenses that kept moving categories, revenue that looked smoother than it should, Emails that went quiet the moment auditors asked questions. My advisors call it risk. I call it the reason this acquisition has to include control, not partnership. If he stays, he will keep doing what he does best. Smiling while he squeezes. The bank rep asks a question about timing, and my attorney answers in the language of closing mechanics. Funds in escrow by noon, releases upon receipt of executed signature pages, confirmation by wire, then the change of control notice goes out. I nod at the right places. I've learned how to look like I belong in rooms that used to make my skin prickle. Even now, with the skyline behind the glass and the binder in front of me, part of my brain is back in that other conference room, the one that smelled like microwaved leftovers and printer toner. I had pitched a business he could have owned a piece of if he'd been capable of seeing value in anyone but himself. He didn't ask for numbers or assumptions. He laughed, and the laughter turned the air into something I couldn't breathe. I used to tell myself I didn't care about him. That was a lie I needed to function. Caring is what kept me awake when I should have been building, when I should have been sleeping, when I should have been trusting my own judgment. The truth is I carried him like a splinter, small but constant, until I started making decisions with his voice in my head as the enemy. I don't want to become him. I don't want to look at people the way he looked at me and feel nothing. But I also can't pretend this is only business. My mouth tastes faintly of coffee that's been reheated too long, bitter at the back of my tongue. I swallow and feel the collar of my shirt tighten, as if the fabric remembers the day he made me small in front of witnesses. He isn't here yet. That's intentional. The closing doesn't require his presence, only his company's obligations and the signatures already obtained. He thinks today is another routine Monday, another chance to walk the hallways and let people orbit him. Maybe he's in his corner office right now practicing the smile he uses for bad news. Maybe he's rehearsing a speech about resilience for a staff meeting he'll never lead. In a few minutes, someone will tell him that ownership changed hands while he was checking email. I try to imagine his face when he hears my name, printed cleanly on the cover sheet. Will recognition arrive immediately, like a slap? Or will he need a second, like a man reading a headline about himself and not believing it? The door handle shifts somewhere outside, and I feel my heartbeat tick once against my ribs, precise as an audit. I glance at my phone, not for messages, but to see the timestamp that will mark the transfer. The screen reflects the ceiling lights, making my own eyes look paler than they are. A paralegal wheels in a cart with the overheated coffee, and the smell turns acrid as the lid lifts. My attorney whispers about one last typo in the red lines, fixed and circulated. I answer quietly, approved, like I've done this forever without looking away. My attorney collects the executed pages and aligns the stack with a quiet, almost reverent tap. Someone murmurs that we're good to go, and the phrase lands in my chest like something foreign. I watch the banker send a final email, his fingers moving fast, his face still bored, and I realize how small this moment looks from the outside. No fireworks, no applause, just paper, consent, and money moving through wires you can't see. I could stand up right now and feel victorious. Instead, I sit still and let myself admit the harder truth. I didn't buy this company just to punish him. I bought it because I saw what he was doing to people, because I saw what he was hiding, and because I learned that sometimes the only way to stop a man like that is to remove his access. But none of this makes sense unless you understand the first time he laughed at me, in that stale office, when I still thought respectability meant kindness. The laugh. 2 years earlier, I still believed that offices were mostly rational places, that adults who wore lanyards and talked about values meant what they said. Our headquarters sat in a glass and brick building that smelled permanently of copier toner and overused carpet shampoo. Every morning, the hallway outside the break room carried a stale microwave popcorn haze, like someone was trying to mask stress with butter flavoring. My boss, Martin, was the kind of executive people described with words that sounded like endorsements. Decisive, charismatic, visionary. Upward, he was immaculate. He played in charity golf tournaments in company polos, grinning beside oversized checks. He forwarded leadership quotes at 6:12 a.m., always attributed to someone dead and famous, always followed by, "Let's bring this energy into Q3. He wrote congratulatory emails in a measured, almost pastoral tone when a team hit a target, and he made sure senior leadership was copied so gratitude could be audited. Downward, the polish thinned into something sharper. In one-on-ones, his voice dropped a half octave, like he was switching to a private channel. He complimented you the way a surgeon might compliment an instrument briefly, then explained how easily it could be replaced. He never yelled. He didn't have to. He used little humiliations that left no bruises, only a lingering sense that you'd imagine the injury. If you asked for clarification, he would blink slowly and say, "I'm surprised you need that explained." And the sentence would sit on your desk all week. The week it happened, the office was in one of its performative moods. Fluorescent lights flattened everyone's faces into the same tired shade. The whiteboard by the main conference room still held ghosted quarterly targets. The red marker scrubbed but not defeated. ARR, churn, pipeline coverage, bold arrows that now looked like stains. Someone had left a tray of supermarket cookies out for a visiting VP, and the sugar smell mixed with toner until it felt slightly nauseating. I had been building a small idea in the margins of my job, not because I was trying to betray anyone, but because I couldn't stop seeing a problem the company refused to see. Our clients kept asking for a tool that didn't exist in our product line, a way to automate a task that everyone was still handling with spreadsheets and late-night manual reconciliations. I sketched it out, built a basic model, ran the numbers on what they were already paying in labor hours. I wasn't asking Martin for permission to dream. I was asking whether the company wanted to be early for once. When his assistant emailed me, the subject line was "quick chat," like it was a favor. The Outlook chime sounded bright and cheerful, an electronic optimism that didn't match my stomach dropping. The meeting invite included Martin, me, and two people I hadn't expected. Jenna from HR and my peer, Caleb, a senior analyst who always managed to be in the right room when something important happened. The conference room was cold enough to make my fingertips feel clumsy. The speakerphone in the center looked cheap for a company that bragged about revenue. It crackled intermittently, even though nobody had dialed in. Martin sat at the head of the table with his laptop open, not looking at it, just using it as a barrier. On the wall behind him was a framed award from a local business journal, the kind of plaque you get for paying to attend the dinner. His name was etched in gold, except they'd misspelled it by one letter. He'd hung it anyway. He didn't start with my work or my idea. He started with timing. "Performance reviews are coming up," he said, lightly, as if he was mentioning the weather. Jenna smiled the polite HR smile that never reaches the eyes and unwrapped a piece of peppermint gum. The smell cut through the stale air, clean and cold, and it made me think of dentist offices. I began anyway. I kept my voice steady. I explained the client problem, the workflow, the projected savings, the pricing model. I talked about implementation in phases, about how we could pilot with 2 accounts and measure adoption. I even mentioned risks because I'd learned that executives respected pessimism more than hope. Martin listened with his chin propped on his hand, eyes narrowed in what I mistook for focus. When I finished, there was a pause long enough for the HVAC to feel louder. Caleb avoided my eyes and stared at the whiteboard stains. Jenna tapped her pen once and stopped, as if she'd been trained not to create recordable rhythm. Then Martin laughed. It wasn't a quick chuckle. It was too loud, too performative, like he was on a stage and the audience needed permission to join in. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head as if I'd told him a joke he couldn't believe I'd attempted. The sound filled the room, bounced off the glass, and then died abruptly, leaving a vacuum so complete I could hear the cheap speakerphone crackle again, as if it was embarrassed. "You want to start a company," he said, drawing the words out, "on top of your current responsibilities. I'm proposing an internal product line," I corrected, careful, "or a spin-out if you want." He lifted a finger, the gentlest gesture. "No, let's call it what it is. You've been fantasizing." The word landed like something sticky. "And you're bringing it to me like I'm your investor." I tried to explain that I'd built it using public knowledge and client conversations, that I hadn't used any proprietary code, that it was more concept than asset. Jenna's peppermint gum clicked softly as she chewed. Martin's eyes flicked to her, then back to me. "You did sign your onboarding documents, right?" he asked. His tone was casual, almost friendly, but I felt the trap in it. Confidentiality, invention assignment, non-solicit. All the standard stuff. I had signed them. Everyone signed them. On my first day, a stack of papers had been slid across a desk with a pen attached by a chain, like a bank lobby. I remembered the language only in fragments. During the term of employment, related to the business, assign and transfer. At the time, it had felt like background noise, the cost of getting a paycheck. Martin smiled as if we were sharing a private joke. Good, he said, because I'd hate for you to get confused about where your loyalty sits. That was the moment my throat went dry. The humiliation wasn't just in his laugh. It was in the way he made the room complicit. He didn't have to call me stupid. He only had to frame me as disloyal and naive, and then watch who flinched. Caleb stayed very still, a man trying to disappear without moving. Jenna's HR smile held, but her eyes darted toward me in a way that said, "Don't make me do my job." Martin leaned forward, lowering his voice, shrinking it until it felt surgical. "You are good at what you do," he said. "You should focus on that. And you should be careful about discussing outside interests. People talk. It can affect how leadership perceives you." He nodded toward the door as if leadership lived in the hallway, listening. I understood the message. My review, my bonus, my role on the next project, even my reputation in an industry that loved whisper networks. None of it was safe if I became a problem. The company had policies for everything, thick PDFs written in neutral language, designed to sound fair while protecting power. If I complained, it would be a misunderstanding. If I pushed, it would be not a culture fit. If I left, they could call it voluntary. Martin stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I appreciate initiative," he said, switching back to his public voice, the one that sounded inspirational. "But we have priorities. Let's stay aligned." He smiled at Jenna as if he'd modeled good leadership for her. Then he looked at me one last time, eyes bright with something like amusement. "And maybe keep the startup fantasies to the weekends." When the door opened, the hallway noise rushed in. Keyboard clacks, distant laughter, the familiar Outlook chime. The smell of popcorn and toner returned like nothing had happened. Caleb walked out beside me, shoulders tight. He didn't say a word until we reached the corner by the printer, where the fluorescent light buzzed loudly enough to pretend it was privacy. "I didn't know he was going to do that," Caleb said finally. His voice was low, careful. "Just be smart." "Smart how?" I asked. He looked away, toward the HR office with its open-door sign, and the peppermint smell lingered in my memory like a warning. "Smart like," he said, "don't give them anything they can use." I went back to my desk and stared at my monitor until the numbers blurred. Around me, people worked, joked, planned their weekends. Martin walked past, greeting someone from sales with warmth he'd never waste on me. His public mask perfectly fitted. I kept thinking about the onboarding documents, about that laugh, about the way silence in that room had felt like a vote. And I realized I had just been shown, in full daylight, exactly how small my future could be if I stayed. By afternoon, I had a calendar invite from Jenna for a check-in, stamped confidential, with no agenda. 10 minutes before it, my access to the client feedback folder required approval. My manager stopped looping me on roadmap emails. Martin never said, "You're being punished." He just let the system do it. That evening, I reread the employment packet in our HR portal, scrolling past phrases like work product and duty of loyalty until my eyes burned. I realized his laugh wasn't about humor. It was about containment. If my idea became real, it would prove he'd missed something basic, and narcissists treat proof like an attack. I went home with my badge heavy in my pocket, planning how to leave without giving him a target. The exit wound, building the first version while being treated like a liability. Within a week of that conference room laugh, Martin stopped speaking to me in complete sentences. He used fragments, delivered in passing, like I was an inconvenience he could swipe away with his hand. Meetings moved without me. Calendar invites arrived late or not at all, and then I'd be asked why my input was missing. My access to client notes began requiring approval, and approvals were slow enough to feel like a reprimand. He never said I was being punished. He just let the system do it, then acted surprised when I fell behind. In the hallway, he would clap a hand on my shoulder in front of other managers, smile wide, and say, "You doing okay? You seem distracted." His voice was warm, a public service announcement. His eyes were cold, asking whether I'd learned my place. By Friday, Jenna from HR sent another confidential check-in, invite with no agenda, and the peppermint gum smell came back into my imagination before I even opened the email. In that check-in, she didn't accuse me of anything. HR never does. She asked how I was feeling, in the same tone doctors use before they tell you to rate pain on a scale. She reminded me, casually, that side projects could become conflicts of interest, and that conflicts had to be disclosed. She didn't say disclosed to whom. She mentioned, as if it was helpful, that the company retained the right to review devices used for company business, and that it was always best to keep work and personal efforts cleanly separated. The word clean sounded like a threat. When I asked whether I'd done something wrong, she smiled, chewing peppermint like she was erasing evidence. "No," she said, "but Martin is concerned about focus. We just want to support you." Support, I learned, was the corporate term for tightening the rope with both hands and calling it a hug. After that, every email I sent felt like it might be printed, highlighted, and read back to me out of context. Martin's strategy was simple. Make me look unreliable, then offer himself as the adult in the room. He reassigned me to a project with no executive sponsor and a deadline that had already slipped twice. When I asked for clarity, he wrote, "Use your judgment," then later criticized the judgment he'd refused to give. He scheduled my one-on-one for 7:30 a.m., a time that guaranteed I'd arrive sweaty and defensive, and he'd arrive calm, holding a mug that smelled like expensive roast. He'd open with praise, "You've got potential," and then slide the blade in, "But your priorities seem scattered." In team meetings, he'd ask me for an update without warning, like a teacher calling on the student he wanted to embarrass. The fluorescent lights made everyone's skin look gray, and I could feel my own face heating anyway. Caleb watched. Sometimes he looked guilty. Sometimes he looked relieved it wasn't him. The day Martin put a performance improvement plan packet on my desk, he didn't announce it. He left it there, neat as a bill, and walked away smiling at someone on the phone. I took the packet home and read it at my kitchen counter. It was written in the company's favorite dialect, neutral words arranged to sound merciful. The plan didn't say I was failing, just that I needed alignment. It didn't threaten termination, just explained possible outcomes. It required weekly documentation, but the metrics were vague enough to move whenever Martin needed them to. A friend who'd survived a similar process told me what it was, managed out with receipts. I asked for a meeting. Martin offered one the next day, and Jenna joined, peppermint and all. They slid a separation agreement across the table like they were doing me a kindness. A small severance conditioned on signing a release, a confidentiality clause, and a non-disparagement clause written so broadly it felt like a gag. Jenna said, "This is standard." Martin said, "It lets you move on with dignity." Dignity, in his mouth, meant silence. I asked whether I could take a week to review. Martin smiled, measured, respectable. "Of course," he said, "but if you're planning to do anything with that idea, you should remember what you signed when you started here." That night I sat at my apartment desk, a cheap laminate table pushed against the wall, lit by a single lamp that made everything outside its circle look like a confession waiting to be heard. Sticky notes climbed the wall in uneven columns. Client pain points, feature sketches, pricing guesses, reminders to eat. My laptop fan whined as soon as I opened a spreadsheet, and the heat from the underside pressed into my thighs. In another tab, a legal blog explained the difference between an LLC and a corporation in cheerful, simplified paragraphs, like it wasn't the difference between freedom and a lawsuit. Through the thin wall, my neighbor's bass thumped in slow, indifferent pulses. I tried to focus anyway, building a crude prototype with whatever tools I could afford, clicking through trial versions, watching the screen stutter when my machine overheated. The smell of instant ramen rose from a cup by my keyboard, salty and chemical. A cold pizza box sat on the floor, its cardboard odor mixing with the metallic scent of warm electronics. I opened my banking app to buy a plugin I needed and watched the purchase decline with a brittle little sound, as if the phone wanted to scold me. I stared at the insufficient funds message until my eyes watered. The humiliation wasn't abstract. It lived in my jaw, the way I'd clench without noticing, and in my shoulders, which stayed raised like they were bracing for a hand to land. Anger helped, but only when I turned it into lists. I started treating my life like it might be examined by strangers with authority. I bought a composition notebook and wrote dates in the top corner of every page, because a mentor once told me contemporaneous notes can matter when memories get contested. Every sketch, every feature decision, every client conversation summary went in there, signed with my initials like I was building a habit of proof. I created a folder structure with boring names: contracts, IP, invoices, correspondence. I stopped using the same password everywhere. I created a clean email domain instead of sending anything from a personal address that looked like a teenager's. Professionalism, I realized, wasn't a costume. It was armor. I paid for an hour with a small business attorney whose office smelled like paper and lemon cleaner. She told me her hourly rate before she asked my name. She listened, then said, "This is not legal advice until we have an engagement letter." And I loved her for it. We talked about invention assignment agreements, about how employers sometimes claim anything you build related to the business, about keeping a clear chain of title if I used contractors. She told me not to use company equipment, not to forward myself anything, not to brag to coworkers. "You don't need to win an argument," she said. "You need a paper trail." I didn't have venture money. I had a severance check that felt like hush money and the last of my savings, plus a credit card I promised myself I would treat like a loaded weapon. The first real capital came from the least glamorous place: a small services contract with a client who trusted me more than my former employer. I offered to clean up their reporting process as a consultant, nights and weekends, for a flat fee. It wasn't scale, it was oxygen. Every invoice I sent felt like I was learning a new language, one where my survival depended on clarity. When the client paid, I didn't celebrate. I moved the money into a separate account and labeled it Runway, because labels make fear measurable. I worked until the rain started tapping the window, thin and persistent, and then I kept working because the sound gave the room a rhythm. The laptop fan screamed harder when I ran tests. My prototype broke in ways that felt personal. Sometimes I'd stare at an error message and think about Martin's laugh, the way it had made my confidence collapse into apology. I forced myself to write down each failure, the cause, the fix, the time it took, like I was training for an exam I couldn't see yet. The next morning I'd drink cheap coffee and pretend I wasn't afraid of becoming the cautionary tale he wanted me to be. 3 weeks after I left, a certified letter arrived at my apartment, the envelope stiff in my hands. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet. It was a warning dressed as professionalism. Their counsel claimed any related work could be company property, reminded me of confidentiality, and demanded written assurances that I wasn't soliciting clients or employees. Martin didn't have to write it. He only had to approve it and keep his hands clean. Caleb texted that people at the office were saying I'd been let go for performance. Like truth was a memo someone could revise. That night, my prototype crashed and wiped a week of changes because I hadn't set up version control. I sat under my lamp, smelling cold cardboard and hot circuitry, and understood grit wasn't enough. If I was going to survive him, I needed structure, governance, documentation, and professionals who spoke his language better than he did. The silent operator phase, turning professional systems into leverage. I kept the certified letter in a drawer, not because I was afraid to read it again, but because I needed to stop reacting. Martin's company wanted me emotional. They wanted me to argue in emails, to confess something I hadn't done, to give them a quote they could staple to a file. So I did the opposite. I got quiet. Every night after my contract work, I sat at my desk under a single lamp and treated my startup like evidence. The air smelled like bitter espresso and warm plastic. My mechanical keyboard clicked in short bursts, the only sound besides my neighbor's bass bleeding through the wall. On my dual monitors, contracts appeared in track changes, red lines like fresh cuts. I started to understand something humiliating and empowering. The grown-ups don't win because they're smarter. They win because their paperwork is cleaner than yours. The first structural decision was formation. An LLC would have been cheaper and simpler, but I needed investors who understood standard terms and a clean path for equity. My attorney explained it without romance. Delaware C Corp, because most institutional money expects it, because option plans are straightforward, because a cap table stays legible when you hire people and grant stock. We filed the certificate, adopted bylaws, issued founder shares, and signed an 83B election before the deadline could become another regret. I opened a separate bank account, registered for payroll taxes even before I had payroll, and stopped treating money like a personal extension of willpower. If Martin ever tried to claim my work was his, I wanted a corporate boundary he couldn't smudge with sarcasm. Then I cleaned up chain of title. I didn't code everything myself, and that's where founders get sued. Every contractor signed an IP assignment agreement and a confidentiality clause before they touched a single file. I used NDAs that were plain, mutual, and enforceable, not the macho one-way templates Martin loved. I created invention disclosure forms for myself, dated, described, and stored in a secure folder labeled Diligence, because I'd learned that I built it first means nothing without documentation. When a freelance designer tried to send me work through a personal Dropbox link, I refused. We used a company account, company email, and a paper trail. I felt paranoid until I remembered Jenna chewing peppermint gum while she talked about device reviews. Operational credibility came next. I hired a bookkeeper who didn't care about my story, only my numbers. We set up basic GAAP bookkeeping, chart of accounts, and monthly closes so I could tell the difference between revenue and cash. I learned revenue recognition the hard way after I almost counted an annual prepayment as profit and then realized I still owed 12 months of service. I wrote a policy memo for myself, boring and necessary, and kept it with the rest of the corporate records. My first CPA asked whether I wanted reviewed financial statements for investor conversations. I didn't have to, but I did it anyway. The antiseptic smell in their lobby made me feel like I was waiting for a diagnosis. When they handed me clean statements, I felt something close to relief, competence that could be verified. After I lost that week of work to a crash, I stopped improvising like a desperate hobbyist. I set up version control, private repositories, and access logs so I could prove who touched what and when. I wrote contractor onboarding steps on a small whiteboard above my desk. The dry erase marker smell hung in the room for days, sharp and chemical. I created a standard customer MSA with limitation of liability, confidentiality, and a data processing addendum, because selling software means inheriting other people's risk. When prospects asked about controls, I didn't bluff. I documented backups, incident response, and vendor management, and I bought basic cyber insurance even though the premium hurt. I drafted employment offer letters with invention assignment language that protected the company without trapping people the way Martin tried to trap me. My attorney reviewed it all, line by line, and every time she found an assumption, she asked for proof. By the end of each call, my ears rang from the silence that followed her favorite sentence. Put it in writing. It became my policy, my shield, my habit. Money followed discipline, not the other way around. My first outside capital came as safe notes, because I couldn't justify a priced round yet and no one wanted to fight about valuation when the product was still young. The first investor asked for a valuation cap and a discount, and I pretended I wasn't terrified of dilution. We built a cap table spreadsheet and ran scenarios until the numbers looked like weather forecasts. Possible, not promised. One investor wanted board observer rights, just to stay informed. My attorney paused, then said, "You need this in writing." The silence after that sentence was its own kind of sound, like a room deciding whether it respected you. We negotiated limits. No access to customer data, no interference. Confidentiality survives termination. I learned to say yes slowly with conditions instead of no loudly out of pride. I built credibility where Martin built theater. I printed a banker-style pitch deck and attacked it with a highlighter, marking every claim that couldn't be proven. The paper smelled like ink and impatience. Slides became less about vision and more about execution. Customer acquisition cost, churn, payback period, retention cohorts. I stopped saying "I think" and started saying "here's the dataset." Late-night calls with advisors carried a faint static. as if the universe didn't fully approve of ambition after midnight. A former CFO I met through a client told me to treat compliance like a sales tool. Your contracts and controls, he said, are part of the product. I wrote it down. I wrote everything down. Meanwhile, Martin posted about leadership. He attended innovation panels and smiled under stage lighting, his public voice measured, sincere, almost kind. He took selfies with interns and wrote captions about building others up. People in my old network liked the posts because liking costs nothing and dissent costs everything. Behind that mask, his company started tightening. Vendors complained quietly about late payments. A recruiter friend told me offers were being rescinded, then reissued with lower base and higher performance components. On a quarterly earnings call, Martin sounded confident, but he avoided specific questions and filled airtime with values language. I listened with headphones on, the foam pressing against my ears, and felt the old anger sharpen into something colder. The difference between us was no longer courage. It was systems. The turning point came through Diligence, before I even knew I was going to buy anything. I was still a competitor on paper, a nuisance with a small but growing product. A vendor who supplied both companies called me to ask whether I'd heard about changes. His voice was careful, like someone walking on wet tile. He mentioned a dispute over terms and a sudden request for extended net payment periods. That's how rot announces itself. In invoices. I asked questions I didn't deserve answers to, and he answered anyway because he wanted his money. Then an accountant I'd worked with years earlier reached out, not as a friend, but as a professional with a conscience that was tired. She didn't give me documents. She gave me patterns. Aging receivables creeping past 90 days, a credit facility drawn down further than it looked, and a single client that accounted for too much revenue for a company that pretended it was diversified. I hired a forensic accountant under an engagement letter and an NDA so strict it felt like a vault. We didn't hack anything. We didn't steal. We used public filings, UCC searches, vendor chatter, and lawful diligence requests once conversations began. We built a model of Martin's company from the outside in cash conversion cycle, debt covenants, client concentration. The fragility wasn't scandalous. It was banal. If their biggest client churned, they would breach a leverage ratio within a quarter. If they lost one vendor, their costs would spike beyond their pricing power. There were whispers about payroll tax exposure, the kind that doesn't kill you quickly, just makes lenders nervous enough to squeeze. That was my opening, and it also explained Martin's laugh. My idea wasn't cute. It was a threat to his story. Once the forensic model held up, we approached the capital side like engineers, not crusaders. A boutique investment banker introduced us to the lender group that held Martin's revolving credit facility. I didn't say his name with emotion. I spoke in ratios, covenants, and downside cases. We discussed a potential amendment, then a purchase of the loan at a discount if they wanted a clean exit. Their counsel asked about my governance, my audited pipeline, my cash forecasts, and my ability to fund a working capital peg at close. I answered with spreadsheets, reviewed financials, and signed attestations, letting my professionalism do the arguing. In parallel, my counsel drafted a term sheet for an SPV that could acquire assets if the deal became distressed, with indemnities, reps and warranties, and a clear waterfall for investors. Every conversation was under NDA, and every email was written as if a judge might read it. When Martin's team finally noticed my traction, they assumed I wanted partnership. I let them keep assuming. That assumption bought me time, and time is what turns private leverage into public inevitability eventually. To make the threat real without making it personal, I separated myself from the purchase. My counsel helped me form a holding company and, later, an SPV for the acquisition, so risk stayed contained and the narrative stayed professional. We explored buying distressed debt because lenders care about covenants more than charisma. I learned how consent rights work, how change of control clauses can force conversations that executives would rather postpone. I sat in a law office lobby that smelled antiseptic and heard terms spoken like prayers. Assignment, novation, representations, and warranties. We used NDAs and non-disparagement agreements at every step, not to silence victims, but to keep Martin from turning it into a public feud. I refused to leak rumors or bait him online, If I won, it had to be in daylight. There was still a line I wouldn't cross. I would not fabricate evidence. I would not threaten his family. I would not punish employees to make a point. My anger wanted spectacle. My ethics demanded procedure. The more I learned, the more I saw the employees as collateral in a machine Martin had built for himself. When lenders finally agreed to talk, it wasn't because they liked me. It was because my numbers were clean, my governance was boring, and my counsel could answer questions without improvising. The day we received the first draft of a letter of intent, my printer fed pages with a soft, relentless whir, and the room filled with the smell of paper warming. I placed the LOI on top of the folder labeled Diligence and realized the trap wasn't made of spite. It was made of signatures. And once the signatures were in place, all that would be left was to walk into his building and watch whether he recognized me before the door closed. Closing day, buying the building while he still thinks he owns the room. By 9:30, the escrow agent emailed confirmation that the funds had cleared and the release conditions were satisfied. It was the least dramatic message of my life, a few neutral sentences that turned a plan into ownership. I walked across the lobby of Martin's building with my counsel beside me. The air was too cold, blasted from an overpowered vent that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and damp metal. Security badge scanners blinked green as employees filed in, swiping plastic with the muscle memory of people who did not know today had been sold. At reception, a woman I recognized from years ago offered a forced smile that did not reach her eyes. Behind her, Martin's nameplate was still on the wall, brushed steel, centered as if authority were a design choice. I signed the visitor log with the same pen I had used to sign the closing papers, and for a second my hand wanted to shake. It did not. The building sounded normal, elevator cables, distant phones, shoes on tile, but the normalness was what made my stomach tight. Somewhere upstairs, a coffee grinder whined, and I tasted bitter espresso in my throat like old resentment again. We were escorted to a small conference room on the 10th floor, not the boardroom Martin used for show, but a quiet room with tinted glass and a table that reflected every ceiling light. My attorney slid a folder across the polished surface without ceremony. Inside were the executed board resolution, the officer certificates, and the change of control notice ready to be released. The paper smelled of ink and copier heat. A paralegal arranged the documents in a stack and tapped the edges until they aligned, the way people do when they need order to feel safe. I sat down, opened my laptop, and pulled up the cap table and closing checklist, not because anyone asked, but because I needed something factual in front of me. The HVAC hummed. Someone's phone vibrated and stopped. My counsel murmured about signature pages, final red lines, and post-closing deliverables, each phrase precise enough to cut emotion out of the air. I answered in the same tone, confirming timestamps and authorizations, while a part of me watched my own restraint, wondering whether power was just another kind of performance. On the whiteboard, old quarterly targets bled through the eraser marks, like bruises still. At 10:15, Deal Counsel confirmed the escrow agent could release funds once the last executed PDFs hit their portal. The bank representative spoke in clipped phrases about confirmation numbers and wire cutoffs. The static of too many late-night calls still felt lodged behind my ears. We reviewed the employment agreement Martin had signed years earlier, termination provisions highlighted in yellow. There were two paths: for cause if we documented breaches of duty, or without cause if we paid severance for a clean release. My counsel reminded me the objective was continuity and risk reduction, not spectacle. We finalized the change of control notices for employees, lenders, and key vendors, keeping every version consistent enough to withstand scrutiny. IT was ready to rotate credentials and revoke administrative access the moment the notice went out. HR prepared COBRA packets and a return of company property checklist, down to laptop serial numbers. A litigation hold email sat in drafts to preserve records before anyone could panic delete. When my attorney said, softly, "You need this in writing," the room went silent and my pulse settled. Outside the glass, the hallway looked ordinary, and that ordinariness made the upcoming collision feel unreal. At 10:42 the elevator chimed, and the receptionist straightened as if she had heard a starting gun. Martin stepped out with sharp cologne that cut through the lobby's cleaning smell. His suit was pressed, his tie not symmetrical, his public mask in place. He greeted two employees by name, touching one elbow lightly, the gesture he used to suggest mentorship. He laughed at something a junior manager said, a laugh meant for witnesses. Then his eyes found me. For a second, recognition did not land. I was just another visitor with counsel, another suit in the building. He glanced at my attorney first, calculating the hierarchy, then back to my face as if searching for a file he had misplaced. The security badge scanners kept blinking green behind him, indifferent. I watched his posture adjust, shoulders tightening by degrees. He walked toward us with the same confident stride I remembered from all hands meetings, but the stride slowed when he saw the folder in my counsel's hands. His smile stayed on, but it became thinner, stretched over uncertainty. He asked, in his public voice, "What is this about?" And the forced warmth in it made my stomach turn. We did not argue in the lobby. My counsel said calmly, "Martin, we need a brief meeting," and he followed us upstairs because the phrasing gave him no obvious place to refuse. In the conference room, the door closed with a soft thunk that felt louder than it should. An HR representative I had never met introduced herself and sat with a printed script. The smell of paper and hand sanitizer filled the corner near her. Martin tried to take the head seat out of habit. My counsel did not stop him. She placed the folder in front of him and opened it to the first page. His eyes moved across the header, and I saw his confidence flicker. He started to laugh, a reflex, the same too loud sound he used to dominate rooms. It began in his throat and died there, like the muscle could not find air. The HR rep read, evenly, that effective immediately there had been a change of control, that new officers had been appointed by board resolution, and that his authority to act for the company was suspended pending review. Martin's hands went still on the table. He looked at me finally today. I kept my voice flat. I told him we had completed diligence and that issues required immediate action to protect employees and the lender group. My counsel summarized the findings without adjectives. Documented harassment complaints, expense reimbursements that violated policy, and misrepresentations made during lender calls that created material risk. That was enough to trigger the for cause section of his employment agreement, but it was also enough to trigger litigation if he decided to fight. We had prepared 2 letters. The first was termination for cause, citing breach of fiduciary duty and misconduct, with no severance. The second was without cause, offering severance conditioned on a release, non-disparagement, and cooperation, including return of company property and transition notes. My counsel placed both in front of him and explained the election plainly. If he signed the separation agreement, he would receive severance, COBRA continuation information, and a neutral reference limited to dates and title. If he refused, we would proceed for cause and issue a litigation hold to preserve relevant records. He stared at the papers as if they were written in another language, and I watched his jaw work, trying to find a way to laugh them away. He chose the without cause letter, not because it saved his pride, but because it bought him time. His signature was jagged, angry, and he pressed hard enough to leave an imprint on the next page. The HR rep kept her voice calm as she explained logistics. He would return keys, badge, laptop, and phone. His access would be disabled immediately. Payroll would process the severance schedule. COBRA election forms would arrive by mail. Martin nodded mechanically, then stood too fast, chair legs scraping the floor. In the hallway, people pretended not to watch. Some looked relieved, eyes soft with a kind of exhausted hope. Others looked frightened, loyal to the old hierarchy because it had fed them. The receptionist's forced smile returned when we walked past, tighter now, like her face was holding itself together. Security asked for his badge and scanned it at the same readers that had blinked green all morning. The scanner beeped, a small official sound, and the light turned red. Martin's nameplate was still on the wall behind reception, but the letters looked suddenly temporary. I noticed how old his cologne smelled when mixed with panic. He did not look back, but I did. Back upstairs, my counsel sent the change of control notice on our timestamp. Within minutes, my phone lit with messages from managers asking what it meant. whether payroll was safe, whether their jobs were safe. I answered only what I could verify. The rest I promised to follow up in writing, because promises without paper had almost ruined me once. I expected Martin's first move to be a demand letter, maybe a claim that the termination was retaliatory, maybe an attempt to tell the story publicly before the documents could. My attorney reminded me that even a baseless suit costs time, and that reputations can be harmed without winning in court. We prepared for all of it. A communications plan, a litigation budget, and a careful record of every decision. Still, when the building went quiet, I felt the dread under the relief. I had removed him, but I had also inherited the culture he built, the fear he trained into people like a reflex. Through the tinted glass, employees walked past the conference room, listening for clues. I realized my real work would start after the paperwork, when I had to prove that authority could exist without cruelty here. Aftermath, the cost of power, the repair work, and the question readers will fight about. By the time the last change of control notices landed in inboxes, the adrenaline had drained out of me. I stayed in the building long after the elevators stopped carrying visitors, sitting alone at Martin's old floor with a paper cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and sour. The office lights were on a timer, so every few minutes the hallway would dim, then flare back to life with that sterile fluorescent buzz. City streetlights reflected in the glass walls, turning conference rooms into aquariums. Somewhere down the corridor, a cleaning crew vacuum rolled slowly. The motors were steady and indifferent. When I finally stood up, I could smell dust in an unused conference room as the door opened, like fabric left in an attic. My laptop ran hot from back-to-back calls. The faint ozone scent of overworked electronics clung to the air around my desk. That night didn't feel like victory. It felt like inheriting a mess with my name on it. I kept a checklist on the table beside me. Rotate signatories, lock down admin access, confirm payroll, notify insurers, preserve records for now. The next morning I met the controller and our outside payroll provider before most employees arrived. The lobby still smelled of lemon cleaner, and the receptionist's smile stayed tight, but the work had to be mechanical. We updated signatory authority at the bank. New authorized officers, new online banking credentials, dual approval thresholds, and a written resolution in the corporate minute book. I signed W-9s, vendor forms, and insurance notices until my wrist ached. We issued novation agreements to key vendors so contracts didn't float in a gray zone, and we sent change of control letters to customers with calm language that promised continuity without admitting weakness. I asked our broker to confirm D&O and EPLI coverage didn't lapse, and I notified the carrier the way you notify a hospital you're about to need them. HR ran a compliance review on every open complaint file and every exit interview Martin had ignored. Payroll was the most delicate. If paychecks failed, nothing else mattered. I sat with the payroll register on screen, watching the numbers line up, listening to the printer feed pages like a slow heartbeat, and I told myself, get people paid, then fix the rest without letting my fear show. I scheduled small listening sessions instead of a grand town hall. Martin used crowds. I needed candor. In the first meeting, people sat with their shoulders raised, eyes flicking to the door as if he might walk in and correct them. I handed out simple feedback forms and asked for specifics. Where approvals bottlenecked, where retaliation lived, which managers were safe and which ones were protected. By noon, I had a stack of paper on my desk, pages smelling faintly of toner and anxious sweat. Some notes were blunt. He screamed with a smile. Others were careful, written in the passive voice employees use when they're afraid grammar will be subpoenaed. A few defended him, praising high standards and accountability, and I didn't dismiss them. Narcissists always leave beneficiaries. I told everyone the same thing. No one would be punished for speaking, but I could not promise outcomes without investigating. Counsel helped me draft a litigation hold notice and a process for preserving emails and Slack logs so the truth wouldn't evaporate. When a senior manager asked whether we were cleaning house, I said we were cleaning systems, and the difference mattered to me because I remembered what house cleaning felt like. My original idea wasn't a moonshot. It was an unglamorous automation layer that turned messy client data into compliant reports, cutting reconciliation time from days to hours. I had seen the same pain in every account. Analysts exporting spreadsheets, emailing attachments, then manually correcting errors that were predictable. The first version of my tool was basically a rules engine and a clean audit trail. That was why it mattered. It didn't just save money, it created visibility. It showed exactly where numbers came from, who changed them, and when. In Martin's world, visibility was danger. His entire reputation depended on being the person who knew things without ever showing his work. The day he laughed, he wasn't rejecting my idea on merit. He was defending a mask. If my product existed, clients would ask why his company couldn't deliver it, and employees would start noticing how much of his leadership was theater. 2 years later, the market answered for him. Customers paid me to solve it, and his largest client quietly piloted my platform while still under contract with him. When I saw their pilot data in Diligence, I understood his laugh had been fear with manners all along, apparently. People assume acquisitions happen because someone stumbles into a pile of money. Mine happened because I treated cash flow like a weapon and risk like a language. I started with consulting revenue, the least romantic capital, and funneled it into product development. Then came recurring subscription contracts, signed one at a time with terms I could actually deliver. I raised a small seed round on safe notes with a valuation cap low enough to be honest and high enough to keep control. I gave investors board observer rights with guardrails, and I kept my reporting disciplined. Monthly closes, cohort retention, churn explanations, no hand-waving. When my competitors boasted, I sent invoices. When lenders started circling Martin's company, I already had clean books, reviewed statements, and forecasts my CPA could defend. The holding company and SPV were not tricks. They were containers that let me buy assets without risking my operating business. The bank didn't choose me because they liked my story. They chose me because my diligence package answered questions before they were asked. The quiet truth is that 2 years was not fast. It was 2 years of choosing boring precision over emotional relief until the math outran him. On the third day, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from an unknown number. I listened in my car, window cracked, engine off. Martin's voice was steady, almost cordial, as if he were leaving feedback after a networking lunch. He said he hoped I understood how this looks, and he warned that people in the industry were already asking questions. He didn't threaten me directly. He didn't have to. A few hours later, his attorney did it for him. The demand letter alleged wrongful interference, retaliation, and defamation, and demanded that I retract statements I hadn't made. My counsel read it once, then told me clinically not to respond in anger. Defamation exposure, she reminded me, is often created by a single sloppy email. We preserved documentation, issued a litigation hold to executives, and centralized communications through counsel. We drafted a factual response. Ownership change was lawful, termination was pursuant to contract, and any complaints would be handled through appropriate channels. We discussed settlement considerations the way adults discuss storms. Not because we wanted one, but because pretending it couldn't happen would be irresponsible. My victory came with a file, not a trophy, and I kept it updated daily. At night, after everyone left, I walked the floor alone. The office after hours has its own texture. Carpets that feel softer, air that feels colder, and a silence that makes your own breath sound like an admission. City streetlights streaked across the glass partitions, and my reflection followed me room to room like a second employee I couldn't lay off. In Martin's former office, someone had already cleared the desk, but his leadership book still sat on a shelf, spine cracked, full of underlined quotes about empathy. I picked it up and felt the cheap laminate cover, the kind that's meant to survive airports. For a moment I wondered whether I had become the thing I hated, the person who decides another person's livelihood with a signature. The difference, I kept telling myself, was intent and process. I didn't fire him to satisfy an old wound. I fired him because the harassment files were real, because the financial representations put payroll at risk, and because leaving him in place would have been an announcement to everyone that nothing had changed. Still, I paid for an exit. I chose without cause because the company needed stability more than litigation. I know some people wanted spectacle, a public takedown with my name at the center. I didn't do it. A fight in the press would have spooked customers, rattled lenders, and turned employee trauma into content. So I kept my tone dull and my statements factual, letting the documents speak louder than I ever could. In the weeks that followed, the building changed in small, measurable ways. Fewer flinches when a door shut, more questions in meetings, managers writing things down instead of improvising threats. And still, after hours, I'd walk past the break room, smell cooling coffee, and feel that old conference room heat rise in my face like it was happening again. I keep thinking about the moment I chose without cause, the moment I accepted that stability sometimes costs money and pride. If you had the legal authority to end a manager's career the same way he tried to end yours, would you fire him immediately to protect everyone, or offer a clean exit and risk him doing it again somewhere else? I don't think there's a clean answer. I only know I refused to write cruelty into the new policies even when my own anger begged for ink.